Now, you've already mentioned again about your recollection about the wounds that you observed. Let me ask you once again, though, about that neck wound. Now, you've told us previously that you recall the neck wound as being about 2 inches to the right of, would you say, the Adam's apple?
The Adam's apple, the center midline of the neck.
And about an inch to an inch and a half above the collarbone.
Yes. On my body, that's where I revisualized that. And that's how I remember seeing it on the patient, President Kennedy.
Now, you also recall a conversation between certain doctors, included among whom you think was Dr. Carrico, with respect to the fact that the wound was in an improper location to be used in the setting of trach, and that a new incision would have to be made.
Yes.
Are you certain in your own mind that this incision that they were talking about was 2 inches away from the neck wound that you observed?
Well, I'm certain in my own mind that it would have been approximately 2 inches from the midline, that the center of the incision would have been 2 inches from the midline. Now, with the extension of the incision on each side, I can't really revisualize that as to how close it came to the wound. But certainly an incision for a trach has to be an inch long minimum on a person that size. How close it came to the wound, I can't revisualize. But yes, I would say 2 inches from the center line of the neck toward the wound would have been 2 inches.
Is it possible that the incision for the tracheotomy could have overlapped to any degree with the wound that you observed? Do you recall observing the incision hole itself?
Yes, I recall seeing that. I recall the bleeding that normally takes place when you make an incision for a tracheotomy. I recall the procedure taking place in my mind. I don't recall, though, that it ran into the wound. As I remember the location of the wound, it would have been possible for it to have happened, but I don't recall seeing that actually happen.
Was there just one attempt at making a tracheotomy? Was there just one incision made?
As I recall, there was one incision made. Now, normal activity in making a tracheotomy is you make a skin cut and then you cut down through the layers of tissue. So in that way, there would have been more than one cut. The initial skin incision is usually the determined length of the entire incision. If it needs to be lengthened, it's done starting back at the top. But I don't remember it having to be particularly made larger, or any comment being made that it wasn't big enough, it had to be bigger. There normally would have been no comment if it had been made too big. Stitching is done afterwards to reapproximate the skin edges. I don't remember there being any discussion of, you made too big a hole, or my goodness, what are we going to do with a big hole?
So
nothing in that way.
So the tracheotomy incision you're talking about was totally separate from the wound.
As I recall it, it was. I do not remember that incision going into the wound area itself. As I recall the locations, it would have been possible for it to, but I don't recall that actually happening at all.
As far as you know, at this point, had any kinds of incisions or cuts been made with regard to the wound itself, separate from the tracheotomy incision? In other words, had it been dealt with by the doctors?
Not that I recall at all. It was not bleeding a great deal, as I recall, either. Therefore, it would not have been an immediate problem to have taken care of.
So it didn't look like there were any artificial cuts made in the wound?
Not that I recall at all.
Sharon, you've also told us that you recall seeing an intact face. You observed no wounds in the facial area or the forward part of the skull at all. Is that correct?
That's correct. I don't remember seeing this figure, but about the face, the top of the head area, as I recall, was also intact. There could easily have been small amounts of blood streaked on the face, but I don't remember a damaged facial area.
Had you seen photographs of President Kennedy before? Did you?
Yes, in the newspaper, magazines, and such.
You were aware then of what he looked like?
Yes.
Why do you think that you didn't recognize him when he was brought in?
Well, mainly because I did not at that time, and I still do not, look at a patient for his identity when he's badly injured. You look for the source of the problem, you look for correcting the problem, rather than at who is this person when there's blood, evidence of blood, evidence of trauma that's taken place. I didn't look at him in that way to, who is this? I looked at him as a person that's hurt and he needs help, and then you look for the source of the problem.
Once Dr. Perry announced to the trauma room the identity of the patient, did you then recognize the facial features of President Kennedy?
Yes, at that point he certainly looked just like he did in the newspaper pictures, magazine pictures and such. You know, he was easily recognizable after knowing who he was,
There was
or being
nothing,
told who he was.
there was nothing to mar that recognition that you recall?
No, nothing at all in the facial area that I recall.
In your description of the head, other than the wound, the massive wound you described in the back of the head, are you stating that there were no other major wounds on the head that you can see, or did you just not perceive them? In other words, could it have been possible that there was a lot of blood covering a major wound, or perhaps a major wound had been closed up? Are you certain in your own mind that there was no other major wound, or could you just not perceive one? Could there have been one there that you didn't notice?
No, I was in the area of the stretcher itself where we went over his head area, we being the people at that end of the table at the time. I don't think there would have been any other wound there, because we specifically looked for them. There was the one in the neck on the front, there was the large one in the back of his head area. You know, we felt at his head, we looked at it, there was nothing there. I can remember touching him and feeling him. I can't remember specific areas like I touched his nose or his ears or anything, but touching those areas of his body above the neck. I don't think there would have been any other wound there.
Do you remember specifically whether or not the temple areas of the head were intact?
I don't remember them being disfigured. When I revisualize it all, I just don't remember those as being disfigured. There could certainly have been some blood on them that I would, even at that time as a student nurse, not thought anything about. If it's a superficial amount of blood and there's no hole, it would have just been blood from another source of injury. But that to me is not disfigurement. I remember an entire face there. I don't remember visualizing blood on his face or temples, but there certainly could have been some.
When was the last time that you either saw or talked to Donna Schloss?
Oh, I can't even give you a date, but I've not seen Donna since graduation from nursing school that I recall. I know that she is presently employed with Department of State as a Foreign Service nurse, as I am, but I've not even corresponded with her since she came into Foreign Service. We just went two different ways, I guess, and I don't remember seeing her since graduation at all, which was in late May or early June, that last week, 1965.
How were you then aware that Donna Schloss was also a Foreign Service nurse?
There's medical information bulletin put out by the medical division to all of its Foreign Service personnel, and we can read in that a list of personnel activities, and she had been hired. It was printed in this bulletin that she was one of the new nurses. It had to be somebody that I knew. But I did not write to her or anything.
Has anyone other than the members of this committee staff ever spoken to you about Dharma Schloss?
No. No. I do know that at various times when I have talked about this to friends, I have said something, for instance, like there was another student nurse and I that went down, but I don't recall ever using her name before to anybody that I was discussing it with. At the actual time that it happened, I may well have mentioned it to my parents in passing, but never to a friend do I remember using her name. And it would be more likely that I did not even mention it to my parents. She had not met them. She was not a friend of the family particularly. It would have meant nothing to them. I don't use names in conversation a lot with my parents or friends, so it's probably likely that even to them, I didn't mention it.
Well, let me ask you this, Donna. Are you now, or have you ever been in any way employed by or connected with any intelligence agency?
No. I've been employed by the United States Army. I worked at D.C. General and the Department of State, all of which are government agencies, but never with any intelligence agencies. Not knowingly. I've never even suspected that anything was an intelligence agency.
Has any member of your family, to your knowledge, ever been employed by or connected with any intelligence agency?
No, to the very best of my knowledge, not at all. My father was a government employee with an air traffic controller with the Federal Aviation Agency. My mother works for the city of Fort Worth as a recreation director. My youngest brother is a professional photographer. My sister works for a solar heat research unit at the University of Houston. My oldest brother is in North Carolina working for himself in private business with construction goods.
Do you have any friends who work for any intelligence agencies?
Well, certainly having worked with the Department of State for the last 5 years, I have met people both in the United States and overseas who have been employed by the CIA. I don't recall specifically talking to anybody employed by CIA that I knew was employed by them about this matter. I'll have to think back through and try to remember who I've talked to about it. But I can't immediately think of any name of somebody I knew was employed by CIA that I've discussed this with.
And when you specifically say CIA, are you also including that you've never spoken to any other members of any other intelligence agencies? For instance, FBI, Army Intelligence?
Not knowingly that I immediately think of in any way. I've not had really excellent or long-lasting friendship relations with people from the intelligence agencies that I'm aware of.
Then have you ever acted pursuant to any request from anybody connected in any way with any intelligence agency?
Not in regard to this matter or any other. Not that I can recall in any way.
I have some before you conclude. Have you spoken with any employees or anyone who was present at Parkland Hospital that day since then? Anyone who was interviewed by any government agency in connection with the circumstances of that day? In other words, have you spoken with anyone who talked to the Secret Service, talked to the FBI, testified before the Warren Commission, telling what happened?
Not not that I remember since leaving Parkland Hospital in October of 65. Certainly at the time, immediate time after it happened, there was discussion among those of us who had been in the area. I remember in the operating room one day, between cases, Dr. Carrico was there, and he was talking with myself, and there were some other people in the immediate area about some mail that he had received, which was, quote, hate mail. And he was talking about this, and it was certainly inferred, although I don't remember the exact words used, that he was in contact with someone about this, whether Secret Service, FBI, I don't know, but somebody of an investigative nature.
During the time you were in the trauma room, you said that you left before the president was pronounced dead.
Yes, I did not remember being there when he was pronounced dead. I just don't remember that taking place at all, so it was after I left.
Do you remember any doctors stating while you were there that the president was dead? It was before they pronounced him dead. Any discussion of the fact that it was hopeless, we've lost him, because apparently the doctors made a final decision after you left, but had they reached some tentative conclusion before you left? What was your impression when you left as to the condition of the president?
That it was, my impression was that it was hopeless, he was going to die, he would be pronounced dead. During my discussion with Dr. Carrico about why he was still breathing, why he had a pulse, and the explanation about the brainstem still being intact, etc., it was already at that point a foregone conclusion that he was a helpless patient. There was nothing that could be done in the operating room. There was nothing else that could be done to save him. Even at that point, I recall it was known that he was going to be pronounced dead. It was simply a matter of time of waiting.
Did you hear any discussion by the doctors concerning the nature of the wounds as to possible directional paths of the bullets which caused them?
Not that I specifically recall, no.
In terms of after a patient leaves the emergency room, assuming the patient is still alive, what is the path that the stretchers take to and from the operating room on the second floor, and who moves those stretchers en route?
The normal path taken would be through a small swinging door into the elevator area, the elevator being the one that goes from the emergency room to the first, second, third floors only.
Who would take the stretcher each?
If it were not usually there would be an orderly with the stretcher. In extreme emergency cases, certainly nurses and or doctors who would be performing the surgery or who would be in the general area and could be of assistance would also be pushing stretchers up. At many points it just becomes who's free to push a stretcher up. On an acute emergency case such as this, it would probably have been the doctors, certainly who were in that trauma room, possibly a nurse or two. You don't deplete the area of the emergency room, but it would have been normal for doctors to have gone with the stretcher on an acute case like that if he had gone to the operating room.
But in a normal case, somewhat less acute than this one, you say it's most likely an orderly would take the stretcher to the elevator.
Right.
Would that orderly accompany the stretcher up the elevator?
Yes, he would go put the stretcher on the elevator. He would take the elevator up to the second floor. He would take the stretcher off of the elevator and ask which operating room the patient was to go to, and probably stay and assist on putting the patient onto an operating room stretcher rather than remaining on the emergency room stretcher.
What would then happen with the stretcher he was removed from? The patient was removed from?
The usual thing would be for him to change the linens and put clean linens on the stretcher and take it back down to the emergency room. Now, if their linens, as a rule, that are visible in the operating room area, that are not green ones, green linen was used in the operating room, or he would use green linen if he knew that in the emergency room we were out of clean sheets at the moment. He could change it there. If there were not sheets readily visible, if they were short on sheets in that area of the hospital, then he could take the dirty sheets and stretcher on the elevator back to the emergency room and change the linen there. Linen in both places would go in a laundry hamper, which is a big cotton bag suspended over some poles on a wheel to hold the laundry bags.
Where was that laundry hamper?
It could be any place. It was on wheels. I don't recall any specific place for a laundry bag.
So the most likely procedure is that the orderly who took it up would help remove the patient to the operating room table or stretcher and then clean the linens, or put clean linens on the stretcher and then bring it back down to the ground floor where the emergency room was.
Mm-hmm. If there were sheets available in the OR. If not, then he would do that same procedure in the emergency room.
Do you know who the orderlies were who were working that day on the emergency room floor and the operating room floor?
No, I don't remember by name nor description. I couldn't even describe them now.
What is the procedure when a patient dies in the emergency room for obtaining the casket? How is the casket obtained, and who obtains it, and how long does it take?
As a rule, there's not a casket obtained. The body is cleaned. Any family members who are there are allowed to see the patient after he's cleaned up. The medical apparatus is removed, IV fluids, Bennett breathing machines, etc. And then the patient is wrapped and the body's packed in the normal way for an expired person and taken down to the morgue area and put at the morgue.
What is it taken on?
Stretcher. The usual emergency room type stretcher that was there. I had never seen at that time, and I don't recall seeing after that, a casket being brought into the emergency room area for a patient. I think that was a unique experience because of who the patient was.
Do you know who called for that casket, or where it came from, or how long it took to arrive?
No, I do not. I don't know when it arrived.
But as far as you remember, it arrived after you had left the trauma room.
In that trauma room area, I did not see a casket at all. Now, when I went back upstairs to the first floor, I went into a classroom where the windows overlook the emergency room entrance. I don't remember it pulling up. I remember it being there. I don't remember it pulling up during the time I was looking. I just remember it being there. So I don't know if it arrived. As I remember it, it would have been there then when I started looking out the window.
Do you recall whether or not there were any other emergencies which would have involved bloody wounds which occurred subsequent to the time that you left the trauma room and went upstairs, and prior to the time you returned about 3 o'clock?
No, I don't. I don't remember talk of any other cases that came in or anything specifically.
So you don't remember if there were some or if there were not?
Right, don't remember either way.
One more question with respect to time frame. After you left the emergency room, you just said that you went back to the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
That would have been, I think you said, between 12:55 and 1:10.
Yeah.
Why did you go back to that classroom?
Well, I knew that it had vision out into the emergency room entrance area from the outside. There was no place else to go, particularly. There was no reason to go anyplace else. That seemed a convenient place to go. There were other students in there. There were some of the teachers in there. In that general area, I don't remember teachers specifically who were there, but I remember a lot of the students, myself included, were standing there at the window looking down. I remember one of the students